In this course, you'll notice we often talk about inverse operations. You know, after adding, we do subtracting. After multiplying, we do dividing. Well, after looking at exponents, we're going to look at roots. Now, we're going to focus on square roots for now, which is the inverse operation of squaring a number. So for example, if I asked you to do 5 squared, that's 5 times 5, which gives me 25. So if I asked you to take the square root, I'm going to take the square root of 25, which is what number multiplied by itself gives you 25. So in other words, what number squared is 25? And the answer is 5. It's really good in this course to be able to recognize your perfect squares up to 12 squared. Now we're going to write these in terms of square roots. In other words, I want you to know that the square root of what is 1? Well, to figure that out, you could do 1 squared is 1, or maybe you just know. So for this one, you've got the square root of what is 2, so you could think of it as 2 squared, or maybe you just know that the square root of 4 is 2. So I'm going to pause the video, and I want you to see how high you can go without using a calculator. When you unpause the video, I'll tell you what the square root of what is 12, but see how many of them you can just remember. Okay, pause and go. Hopefully you pause the video. So now let's go through our perfect squares. So the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 16 is 4, the square root of 25 is 5, the square root of 36 is 6, the square root of 49 is 7, the square root of 64 is 8, the square root of 81 is 9, the square root of 100 is 10. Now here's where you may have stopped. Right? If you know up to there, you're doing great. If you don't know past here, you're probably going to be just fine because you're just going to learn them over time, and these ones aren't as used as much. But in case you want to learn, the square root of what is 11? In other words, 11 squared is 121. And the way I remember it is, you know, you put the 11 on the outside and then you add them together and get that 2 in the middle. And then 12 squared is 144. And again, you either know them or you'll learn to recognize them, or you can rely on a calculator for those. But make sure you're comfortable with 1 to 100. What are the perfect squares between 1 and 100 at least? Now, what we're looking at here is what's called the positive or principal square root. So if you're taking the square root of 36, you're just going to say it's 6. Right? It's a positive square root, and you get a positive answer. The only way you can get a negative answer with a square root is if there's a negative out front. So this is -1 times the square root of 36. In other words, this is -1 times 6 or -6. So what about the square root of -36? So what if there's a negative number under the square root sign? And what you're going to write is that this is not a real number. Okay, if you think back to our point something where we were classifying numbers and we talked about the real number system, you know, you've got real number, rational, irrational, whole, integer, natural. This is the opposite of that. This is not a real number. In fact, we call these imaginary numbers. But anytime you see a square root of a negative number, your answer is going to be not a real number. And that's because only positive numbers can have square roots because it's something multiplied by itself. 6 times 6 can only give 36. -6 times -6 can only give me 36. In other words, you can only times something by itself and get a positive number because you have an even number of negative signs or you're multiplying all positives together. So the square root of a negative number is called complex or imaginary, or you could say it's not a real number. We will cover this in a bit more detail in Chapter 7, but really, if you want to learn more about imaginary numbers and their use, you should go on and take Math 60. So here we go. Here's just a few examples that I want you to find the square root of. Try not to use a calculator. I know I always cheat on this last one, but see how you can do. So pause the video, take the square root, and let's see what we get as an answer. All right, so hopefully you gave these ones a go. The square root of 81 is 9. You know, you can just look above, or maybe you're starting to recognize that as a perfect square. Square root of -81, you're going to say not a real number. Okay, it does not exist in the real number system. Whereas -81, square root of 81, is -1 times 9, or -9. Square root of 0 is 0, right? There's a perfect square we didn't put on our list, but anything times itself or 0 times itself would still be 0. And if you look at a question like this, you can think of it as the square root of 9 over the square root of 16. That's something we'll be doing more in chapter 7. But you can take the square root of the numerator, which is 3, or the square root of the denominator, which is 4. In other words, 3/4 times 3/4 is 9/16. Now, the square root of 0.16, awesome if you knew it. It is just 0.4, right? 0.4 times 0.4 is 0.16. But if you had to use the calculator to do that one, that is just fine. All right, good luck with your square root assignment.